I'm really glad to introduce to Bad Faith podcast for the first time, Mr. Rami Khouri. He is a distinguished public policy fellow at the American University in Beirut and also a Palestinian-American author, opinion columnist, and analyst covering the Middle East for the last half century. Welcome to Bad Faith.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Now, obviously, people have been paying a lot more attention to the region, not just because of the aftermath of October 7th and the ongoing siege on Gaza, but because of more recent escalations, including most recently a drone attack on Beirut, Lebanon, that resulted in the assassination of a senior Hamas official, Salah al-Aruri. In the wake of this and some other actions, including the blockade of the Red Sea, a lot of people are asking questions about the potential inevitability or likelihood of a broader regional conflict. So first, I want you to weigh in on what you make of this most recent drone bombing. And Yoav Gallant, Israel's defense minister, saying he does not want an escalation. What do you think is likely to happen here?
Nobody really knows what's going to happen. But there are at least half a dozen possibilities. And one of the complexities of the Middle East these days, especially this region of the Levant and the West Asia, is that there's so many local actors who are antagonistic to each other. Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, the Ansarullah, Houthis in Yemen. Those are people who are right there. And then you've got from beyond that immediate area, you've got the Iranian government, the Turkish government, the Israeli government. Then you've got the Americans and the Russians with their armies in action all the time in different countries. So, there's so many different military elements in the region, and they're all on edge, and they're all potentially participants in a big regional conflagration. For the moment, they tend to focus on local conflicts and clashes. But I think what's going to happen is that because the Israelis essentially broke the agreement that Hezbollah and Israel have had since 2006 about the rules of engagement militarily, which used to be that if one side killed a soldier, on the other side would kill a soldier. If they attacked the village, the others would attack a village. That they do tit for tat things, and then they'd stop. So they feel their honor was preserved on both sides without going to a whole big war, which they did in 2006. And I was there in Lebanon, and it was just a catastrophe for Lebanon, and for Israel it was pretty damaging as well. But the next one would be just enormously catastrophic for both countries, for their infrastructure, for their civilians, and everything else. So this is what I think we're going to see. We're going to see calibrated, directed actions by Hezbollah at the moment that it thinks is the right time, at the right target. Could be in Israel, could be somewhere else, to just hit back and send the message to Israel that you can't just come into Beirut and assassinate a senior Hamas leader and other people with him and get away with it. So where that is, when it is, we have to wait and see.
I mean, can you speak a little bit to the significance of Salah al-Aruri? Because on some level, people are making the comparison that this would be akin to if Mexico were to say there is a member of a terrorist group that we've identified that's been hiding in Texas, and therefore we're going to send a drone in to kill him and to fire at a residential building that they're inside of, and that it's an undermining of American sovereignty, and in this case, the sovereignty of Lebanon, which, as you just alluded to, has been violated in very recent history by Israel, both in 2006 and previously in 1982, and a number of smaller scale border skirmishes that you describe as sort of a tit for tat. Is that analogy a fair one, a right one, as you look at the scope of international law here? How should we understand the kind of gravity of this incursion into Lebanon?
The analogy is not a very good one. It's not very accurate, at least not comparable to what we have in the region. People breaching other people's sovereignty is a routine event in the Middle East, unfortunately, practiced both by Israelis and Arabs and Americans and Russians and Turks and Iranians and everybody else. The foreign armies have been actively involved in warfare in the region here, in this Middle East region, since Napoleon, which is what, 1798 or something like that. Since Napoleon, they've had foreign armies, not just coming in here and colonizing and occupying, but actively engaged in fighting, killing local people, whatever. So this is a problem, the runaway militarism of the region. Anyway, that's something that hopefully will end one day. But what's happened in the meantime, in the last, I would say, 30 years or so, we've had two really huge developments. One is that the region has, after the end of the Cold War, after the Soviets and the Americans stopped counterbalancing each other, the region kind of opened up, and there was a lot of dynamism, and it ended up with several regional powers that emerged: Turkey, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia. They're the major ones, and then there's others. And these regional powers have been very active in forming alliances, trying to get bases around the region for their navies and armies and whatever. So that's one of the things that's happened, which is creating a situation where sovereignty is really trespassed on very easily by everybody in almost every country, unfortunately.
So what it sounds like you're saying is, I'm sorry. What it sounds like you're saying is that the analogy is inaccurate only because it happens frequently in the Middle East and infrequently in the United States of America, but not that the kind of character of what's being described is so different than what it would feel like, or what it would maybe not feel like because of how frequently it happens in the Middle East, but what it would mean in terms of a breach of sovereignty for America to bomb a terrorist in Canada, or Mexico to bomb a terrorist in the United States of America.
Right. These kinds of examples, it really depends on the places, the time, the participants, and each one might be a little bit different. In theory, that should not be acceptable. You shouldn't go into another country and use military force without the permission of that country's sovereign government. But it's what the problem in the region is: Lebanon and Israel are constantly at war with each other. Hezbollah, let's say, and Israel. The Lebanese army, not so much, because it's small and weak. So Hezbollah and Israel have constantly been fighting each other for the last 25 years or so, ever since Hezbollah was born in the 1980s. And therefore, these kinds of attacks and actions are pretty routine, and they haven't solved anything. This is one of the great dilemmas, that this rampant militarism by everybody has not solved any of the basic problems, and in fact has made them probably much worse for most of the civilian populations. The second great change, other than the emergence of these regional powers that throw their weight around the region, the second big change is really in the last, I would say, 15 years or so. We've seen non-state actors, military groups that are not sovereign governments, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Ansarullah or the Houthis in Yemen, and some others here and there. Those are the four major ones. These are militias, essentially, that are armed pretty well and trained, and they've gotten a lot stronger in the last 15, 20 years. They've gotten so strong and capable with technology, surveillance, for protecting their military equipment, training, and their coordination with each other, from Yemen to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to Palestine. They've created a whole regional network of like-minded forces. They call themselves the Axis of Resistance, and they are very close to Iran. Iran helped arm them, train them, fund them, and get them going, but they're all anchored in local national identities. So Hezbollah is a force from Lebanon that defends Lebanon. Hamas is Palestine, Ansarullah is in Yemen. These are not regional Islamic forces that want to go around and turn the whole region into one Islamic state. There's other people who try to do that, and none of them have really succeeded. At least, not since the 7th and 8th centuries. The important thing now is that Hezbollah and Hamas have reached levels of proficiency where they can deter Israel sometimes. Certainly Hezbollah has reached that point because there hasn't been major warfare in the Lebanon-Israel border since 2006. Hamas is moving in that direction. They haven't gotten there yet, but their action on October 7 showed capabilities that people had never seen before. Its ability to protect its rocket launchers and its stores of rockets and other things, its intelligence, its underground network, all the things that it has shown itself capable of doing are things that it developed in the last 15, 20 years. And the Israelis are having a really difficult time achieving their goals in Gaza. The goals, as stated by the Israeli government, were to wipe out the whole Hamas leadership and the organization. All its capabilities should be wiped out. Release the prisoners, the hostages that had been taken in the October 7 attack, and never let Gaza be ruled by a group like Hamas again. It's unlikely they're going to be able to achieve those goals, and they certainly haven't yet, with enormous advantages over Hamas in the Israeli military, with the full active support of the United States, sending arms wherever it wants, and the U.S. bypasses the Congress. Who cares about the law? We've got to help the Israelis. And still, the Israeli government is not able to achieve its goals, and it's doing things that it said it would never do, like have a ceasefire. So they've had several ceasefires to exchange the prisoners, to negotiate. So you're seeing here a ability of indigenous Arab military movements or forces to confront Israel, stand up to it, challenge it, and not be afraid of it. And they take a beating. Gaza is a mess. But still, this is what Hezbollah went through 15 years ago, and now they're not taking a beating because Israel is concerned about attacking them full force. So this is the dynamic now that really matters, the coordination among these groups with Iran, and they're getting enormous support among the public. Public opinion polling proves this all the time. So this is where we're at right now, and that's why it's so hard to predict what's going to happen next.
Well, I think it might be useful for you to unpack what they mean by, or why it is that they feel the need to resist Israel, because obviously the mainstream Western framing of this is that there are a bunch of quote unquote Islamic terrorist groups who are hell-bent on ending the state of Israel because of their deep-seated anti-Semitism, and that this is not an axis of resistance, but an axis of evil founded by Islamists in Iran who want to end the only democracy in the Middle East. And when we have conversations about military groups across the region acting in simpatico to resist Israel, I think it's important to lay the foundation for what kinds of conflicts have existed between Israel and its neighboring countries, and what, in some cases, and in the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon, generated the impulse to form Hezbollah as a military group in the very first place.
Well, those are quite a few different dynamics that all link up in the end. So let me quickly say, Hezbollah and Hamas, for instance, why did they come into being? They came into being in the 1980s, both of them. Hezbollah came into being in the early mid-1980s because there were conditions in South Lebanon where the Shiite Muslim Lebanese were the dominant population, and Hezbollah is very much a Shiite group, but they worked to defend all of Lebanon. The Shiites were mistreated. They were discriminated against. They had the poorest jobs, the lowest level of development, etc. And Hezbollah was one of several groups that worked for social justice advancement, and they worked at the local level. And gradually, the Israelis kept attacking South Lebanon because they wanted to hit the Palestinian guerrillas who were based there after they left Lebanon, after they left Jordan in 1970. The PLO and Fatah Arafat, these guys came over to South Lebanon, had bases, training camps, and they do little attacks into Israel, pretty small stuff, but the Israelis kept attacking Lebanon. At some points, they went and bombed the airport in Beirut. They did other things. So the constant Israeli attacks against Lebanon culminated in 1982 with a big attack where they took over all of South Lebanon and occupied it for some years and tried to create a Lebanese army, what's the right word, Lebanese army in South Lebanon of local people who were funded and armed and trained and protected by the Israelis. And of course, this is not acceptable to the majority of Lebanese, but they couldn't do anything about it. And that's when Hezbollah started getting stronger, because the Lebanese government was not protecting the South. The Lebanese government couldn't keep the Israelis out. And Hezbollah then started getting strength. The Iranians helped it. And Hezbollah, with others in Lebanon, leftist groups, the Communist Party, Arab nationalist groups, and some others started fighting back against the Israeli occupation. And ultimately, the Israelis pulled out in 2005. They pulled out because the cost of staying in South Lebanon was just too high. They were getting killed, and it was just too much for them.
And what was the goal? Was it a kind of a land grab, territorial expansion?
Israel's goal?
I mean, I understand, having read a little bit, that the often described as pretextual impetus for the 1982 incursion was that there was an assassination attempt on the Israeli ambassador to England in the UK, and that was kind of the stated rationale for what
that was
what justified the invasion. But realistically speaking, a multi-year occupation and land grab where you're training local soldiers to defend an area, I mean, what was the long-term goal of Israel?
The truth is that it probably did not have a long-term goal other than to affirm its military strength, affirm its willingness to occupy, colonize, and beat up and kill Arabs and imprison them in thousands at a time, and to deter them, to try to teach these Arabs a lesson, whether they're Palestinians or Lebanese or Syrians, whatever they may be, teach them a lesson. And in the mythology of racist Israelis and equally racist Americans, that the Arabs and Muslims only understand the language of violence. And this is what, in the United States, centuries ago, they used to say this about Native Americans, about African Americans, about other people who didn't go along with the white male majority in Washington that made the rules. So I say these are people who only understand the violence. And they wanted to keep showing this. And this is exactly what they're doing now. It's exactly the same thing, showing this show of force that they can kill and move and put people out of cities, destroy cities, simply because they have the power to do it. The aim is not articulated clearly. And the aims that they do offer in Gaza, for instance, now are not easily realizable. In South Lebanon, there are other factors. Some people say the Israelis wanted to grab the water in several rivers, the Litani and others in South Lebanon. But then they eventually got out. They got out because it was too costly for them. Other people said, there was some stuff in the south of Lebanon that's in the Bible. This is part of the biblical land of Israel. So there's different excuses they give. And the irony of all this, the sad irony, is that the Israelis have used the same techniques against the Palestinians as they did against the Lebanese, as they did in Gaza, which is also Palestinian, but in a different period than they did against the PLO 30 years ago, is that they keep saying that these people hate us because we're Jews, they just want to kill Jews, and we have to beat them up, teach them a lesson. Israelis have never tried a serious peace negotiation. They've been forced into a few of them here and there, like Oslo and Madrid, but none of them worked. None of them were really serious. And the Israelis have never tried to resolve the conflict they have with their neighbors by negotiating a system that allows the Jewish majority state of Israel to live in peace, a recognized peace and sovereignty, while allowing a Palestinian state next to it to live in peace and sovereignty, or maybe have one big state. They all live together as equal citizens, whatever they want to negotiate. But this is not happening because Israel was created by the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement started in 1896 in Europe by a small group of Jews who understandably wanted to find a place in the world where they could live peacefully and not be constantly subjected to pogroms and death and concentration camps and discrimination and racism that they were suffering in white racist Russia, Europe, and North America. And so they said, let's create a Jewish state. And they looked around and they decided to do it. The British more or less convinced them to do it in Palestine because there's an ancient link between the Jewish people and the land, which there is. But the land was 96% or 95% Palestinian Arab. We're talking about 1910, 1915. And so the creation of a Jewish state that was created in 1948, the State of Israel was created in 1948, and it led to the expulsion of around 750,000 Palestinians. Some fled, most of them were driven out by Zionist militias, did ethnic cleansing, exactly what they're doing now in Gaza. And that's the core conflict that the Zionists and the Jewish immigrants, with the help of the British and then later the Americans, came in here, forcibly took our land. It was 95% Palestinian owned and lived. And now it's 80% Jewish Israeli and about 20% Arab. Those who didn't flee, including my family in Nazareth, they're still there. So that's the core conflict. That's the core conflict. And our view is that we can resolve this conflict. We recognize the state of Israel now. The Arabs have given offers to Israel, formal peace plans, which the Israelis have never even responded to. So that's why there's this constant fighting between them, the different Arab groups and the state of Israel. Iran came in later with the Islamic Revolution. Before the Islamic Revolution, the Shah of Iran was a very close ally of the Israelis, and he'd send them oil and arms and stuff like that. And the conflict is a regional conflict because if you look at public opinion polling all across the Arab world, go to there's a really good research center called the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, or just the Arab Center Washington. Go to the Arab Center Washington on their website. They do polls every year or two of the whole region, and they constantly, repeatedly show 70, 80, 90% of Arabs don't want to make peace with Israel until Israel allows a Palestinian state to exist. Once a Palestinian state exists and a negotiated peace happens between the Palestinians and the Israelis, then all of the Arab people will happily coexist with the Israelis. So that's
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder about the role of the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing, and the fact that so many of the surrounding countries ended up accepting thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian immigrants who might now influence the perception of how Palestinians are treated and have solidarity with them, precisely because they have been living next to each other now for the better part, of 75 years or so. I mean, I was very interested to read recently that something between 200,000 and 300,000 Palestinians ended up in southern Lebanon, exactly where Hezbollah originated. And it wasn't clear from what I was reading whether or not the implication was that Hezbollah was largely the result of literal Palestinians who were advocating and fighting for and deciding to militarize as part of the effort to defend themselves and reclaim their own sovereignty and right to live in Palestine. But it certainly does seem like an easy connection, and also flies in the face of the persistent narrative that the Arab world is indifferent to Palestine, so indifferent to the humanitarian needs of Gazans in particular, that they are unwilling to accept refugees, as opposed to them being unwilling to facilitate ethnic cleansing as it's being announced now more and more at the highest tiers of the Israeli government.
Yeah, well, again, there's several different points you make there. The Arab countries have largely been helpful to the Palestinian refugees when they could be. Some of them were better than others. Jordan gave them citizenship, for instance, in 1950. Others had them just stay there. If they stayed in camps, if they wanted to live and rent an apartment, they could, whatever. So they let them just try to get on with their life. The United Nations UNRWA, UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, provided the refugees with basic medical, education, and health needs, and this population has grown. The original refugees in 1947-48. By the way, about a third of the 750,000 refugees, there were 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees when Israel was created in May 1948. They found themselves outside the borders of the state. They were driven out by the Israelis, or some of them fled because there was fighting. But about a third of them had become refugees before the fighting started in 1948. Very brief fighting between Israel and some Arab armies. So the Israelis had driven these people out because they wanted more land for their Jewish state, the Zionist state that became Israel. This is well documented by so many Israeli and Arab and Western historians that it's beyond any kind of dispute. But if you say people, Arab countries could not be more helpful to the Palestinians, the ratio of Palestinians who left Palestine and went outside, who were driven outside the borders in 48, was about half the Arab population. So if this happened in the United States today, if half the American population, say 170 million people, were suddenly in Canada, the Canadians are going to say, well, welcome for a while, but we can't take all of you. We don't have room. So
well, that would be more people than are in Canada currently.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not a question of absorptive capacity. The Israelis and their fascinating but totally non-credible propaganda say all the time, we have such a little piece of land and there's 22 Arab states and we're only one little Israel. Look at all this empty space they have in Saudi Arabia and in Algeria. They could put these people anywhere. Of course you could put them anywhere. But it's not a question of where you could put. It's not absorptive capacity. It's fundamental human rights that people want to stay living in their countries. And this has been one of the amazing dimensions of the Palestinian story, which is not well represented or appreciated in the West. The sort of stubborn heroism of the Palestinian will to keep working for their rights in any way they can, mostly peacefully. Then eventually, after 20, 30 years of getting nowhere, they started creating little groups of armed men and some women. And the PLO was formed in the 1960s. And here we are now with these big military groups. The amazing insistence by the Palestinians, who now number, by the way, around 13 million. There was 1.5 million Palestinians in 1948. Half of them were thrown out of the country. So 750,000 stayed in Palestine, and the others were refugees outside. Those refugees now number around 6 million who are outside in camps and other places, and they're not all in camps, but many are. And the total Palestinian population today is around 13 million. So it gets tougher and tougher to resolve the conflict through negotiations, but it's still doable. And there's been great studies done by Palestinian and other scholars showing that there's plenty of room to let many of the refugees back, or at least the old people, and the younger people might go to a Palestinian state or whatever they negotiate. So it's not a question of mechanics of is there room here. It's a question of humanity, your basic human dignity. It's exactly what the Jews felt in Europe in 1896 when they were mistreated by the racists in Europe, and they insisted on getting their rights as human beings. Most Jews didn't want to create a Jewish state. Most Jews wanted to continue living in Europe and Russia and elsewhere, but to live with full rights as full citizens. without discrimination and beating up and pogroms, etc. So, the Palestine issue connected with other forces in the region: Arab nationalism, Islamist movements, resistance movements, decolonization movements. And it's, the reason that so many people around the world support Palestine, it's amazing. You've been walking down Fifth Avenue and you see a march for Palestine, or go to Grand Central Station, or go to Union Station in Washington, and there'd be some people with flags for Palestine saying ceasefire now, or wherever. This is all over the world. And the reason is because people instinctively recognize in their bones, you don't have to tell them this, they feel it in their bones. This is the world's last anti-colonial struggle. This is the last liberation struggle from the colonial period that lasted 300, 400 years. And the Zionist movement was a settler colonial movement. They used that term themselves, the settlements and colonies, and they came in and created these settlements, and eventually, with all kinds of things happened, which I don't have time to get into, they got a state. They created their state, and they keep expanding. They keep expanding, and they apply apartheid rules.
I want to drill down a little bit more specifically on why it is that you've described that there are these various members of the axis of resistance, these resistance groups that have emerged separate and apart from official government entities in Lebanon, in other parts of the Arab world. And you described earlier Lebanon's government as being too weak to resist incursions by Israel. I wonder if you can help us understand what the dynamic really is there, because I can see some interesting implications of that. One being that there is an illegitimacy in the national stage to groups like Hamas or Hezbollah that are intermittently described as both terrorist groups and as at least in the case of Hamas, legitimate governments, to the extent that you can say a government is legitimate if there hasn't been an election in so many years and half the population is underage, and even more than that, wasn't old enough to vote when the last election occurred, all of those things. But still the official government of Gaza. And because they're in that liminal space, they can be alternately written off as not worth negotiating with, or assassinated, as this person was in Lebanon, despite him being a part of the political wing of Hamas as opposed to the military wing of Hamas. But so many Westerners don't make the distinction or ask themselves whether or not that is an appropriate action. And so, I mean, how is it the case that Hezbollah manages to be this obviously significant military force within Lebanon without it having actual political dominance within Lebanon in a way that would be, legitimate as a part of the Lebanese government? And how is that relationship perceived by people within Lebanon? What is the attitude toward Hezbollah there?
Yeah, these are very sensitive but real issues, and you describe them well in certain arenas and not well in others. The not well arenas you ventured into were saying that they're illegitimate, and Hezbollah is in the parliament in Lebanon. They started as a social services movement, a social justice movement. Then they started getting armed and trained to repel the Israelis in South Lebanon, who kept coming in and encroaching on them and threatening them. And then they became a big, powerful force. And they had to become a big, powerful force, and others joined with them, because the Lebanese government was unable to marshal its military resources to protect the country. The Israelis were coming. I remember living in Lebanon in the 60s and 70s and 80s. The Israeli planes were flying overhead, and they'd bomb and they'd do whatever they want. And they'd come into Lebanon and assassinate people. Ehud Barak, one of the prime ministers of Israel, came in with a group of people, and he came in by boat dressed as a woman and with others, and they went and assassinated 7 or 8 Palestinian leaders in their homes at night and went back. So the Hezbollah became a force because somebody had to protect Lebanon, and somebody in Lebanon had to protect Lebanon. And that's how they emerged. Same thing with Hamas. They emerged because the Palestinian government was totally inept. Arafat tried hard, but couldn't achieve the kind of results that the PLO wanted to try to achieve with Israel, and they couldn't do it for various reasons. And therefore, Hamas grew and grew. And they then also became a political movement like Hezbollah did. And they won the parliamentary elections in, I think, 2006 it was. They won the parliamentary elections. So the prime minister of Palestine was a Hamas man. And so they're constantly in the worlds of militant resistance and political governance. The reason that people vote for them in both cases is partly because they think they can protect them militarily, and partly because they think that these people will lead to better living conditions ultimately down the road in their regions, so schools, education, jobs, etc., water. So these things are all linked together. You can't really separate them. These are not just bands of wild men with long hair and knives in their teeth who came out of the caves and suddenly, took over the government. These are people who emerged organically from within the innards of the society. They reflect the insistence of these Arab societies to live in a life of dignity and opportunity and decency for their citizens. Right. They engage in military acts, but I'll tell you, if people in the West want to compare the military acts of Hamas and Hezbollah, some of which clearly are terrorist acts. When they attack civilians, that's terrorism. When you attack a pizza parlor in Tel Aviv, that's terrorism. Absolutely. But if we want to talk about terrorism, I would love to see a table of acts of terrorism by Hamas and Hezbollah on the one side, and acts of terrorism by the Israeli government on the other, and a third list of what the British and the Americans did in the Middle East over the last 100 years.
That's what's so hard, is that accurately characterizing. There are these demands to condemn terrorism, obviously, and
which we all should do. We all should condemn terrorism,
right? But I think the difficulty, right? But the difficulty is it a condemnation of an act of terrorism, or is it a condemnation of a broader resistance movement or entity, which sometimes does acts of terrorism, much the same way that we see, or many people, at least not myself, but many people see our own military as a force of greater good that also sometimes errs and does acts of terrorism. And that nuance that sometimes we allow for our own government, where we say, well, Abu Ghraib wasn't right or legal, but that doesn't stand in for the entirety of the American military, isn't allowed when we're talking about some of these groups. And it seems further complicated by the fact that you have what starts as a social services and then military group that gains political power, instead of the top-down understanding that we have of a government that establishes a military. And I think that is also complicating a conversation. When we're not talking about the Lebanese government or the Lebanese military, we're talking about Hezbollah. Do you see what I'm saying? Right. That I think that's part of the dissonance here.
Well, it is, and what you said is, I think, generally correct. These groups emerged, and there's many others like them. The Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, which doesn't really have a military wing. It used to years ago, but they emerged. They're a religious proselytizing group. There's many social justice movements across the region. Some are tribal, some are religious, some are ideological. These all emerge in these societies out of a need. Humans are social beings. We live together in groups. We live in families and neighborhoods and communities, and the communities usually have mixtures of different people. Sometimes they're, uni-ethnic, so you have Protestants here, Catholics here, Blacks here, Hispanics here, Arabs there, Muslims there. It varies, but wherever you live as a human being, you expect some basic services, your basic rights. You need to be able to know that you can go to school and come home and not be kidnapped or bombed. You need to know that you can get medical care if you need it, and maybe a job will be available as you graduate. Basic fundamental things, clean water, and governments normally provide these things. If they don't provide them, the people then start looking around for somebody else to provide them. And that is one of the ways in which groups like these emerged very forcefully, because they started providing these services, and then the security services, and then the representational services in the parliament when they were elected or as ministers. So these are very multifaceted groups. They're not unifocal, and therefore people have to look into the picture by looking at different dimensions of what these groups do, why they do it, where they came from, and why doesn't anybody else do what they're doing? And that's how you really can understand why these groups are seen to be legitimate. But they also generate a lot of opposition. You know, a lot of Lebanese don't want Hezbollah to be so strong. A lot of Palestinians, not a lot, but you know, a good number of Palestinians don't want Hamas to have this kind of power. Now, of course, there's a lot of support and sympathy for it, but so these are not angels, nor are they, you know, one-party systems. They're very complex groups living in very complex, ravaged societies. So it's hard to evaluate them like you would evaluate, you know, municipal government and the east side of New York or southern Washington, D.C. or something like that. But by the way, I said, you know, that, you know, we have to fight terrorism. We absolutely have to fight terrorism. We have to fight anti-Semitism. We have to fight apartheid. We have to fight anti-women's rights forces. And we have to fight all of these things simultaneously because they all come out of the same wellspring of ignorance and hatred and fear. I mean, why do people not like Black people or Muslim people or Arab people or bearded people or whatever? It's not out of any clear knowledge. It's out of fear, out of ignorance. And we see it in the United States now, the right-wing groups that are growing. So these things have to all be tackled together. And there's a strong movement now going on where pro-Palestinian groups are connecting with African-American activists and women activists, Native American activists. By the way, it's also important for people to recognize that the Palestinian rights movement is now one of 4 global movements. There are 4 movements that generate huge parades and marches and demonstrations and support all around the world on a regular basis are the climate justice movement, the Me Too women's rights movement, the Black Lives Matter civil rights movement, and the Palestine movement, Palestine rights cause. These are 4 global movements, and they fit into what I said, that we are now fighting the last anti-colonial battle. And people understand this. And that's why people in Indonesia march in their millions on the streets, or in countries all over the world, or in Ireland or whatever.
Well, to that point, I wondered if you could speak to the relationship, the shifting kind of allegiances that are happening in the Middle East, because my understanding, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, was that there, prior to this moment, prior to October 7th, there were multiple Middle Eastern countries where the leadership in, say, Saudi Arabia was incentivized in moving in the direction of normalizing relationships with Israel for the broader economic benefits of having done so, trade with the West, et cetera. And that post October 7th, and more particularly post the ongoing siege on Gaza, the populations in those countries, not the leadership, but the populace, is so angered by what they're seeing in Gaza that it's forced the governments of countries like Saudi Arabia, which have been brokering these closer relationships with Israel and the West, to not participate in things like the American effort, the Western-led effort to combat the Red Sea blockade. Maybe not going so far as to open full, to full-throated solidarity with Palestine, but certainly saying we're not gonna get in the way of what the Houthis are doing in trying to show solidarity with Palestine. So, what do you see next there? How far do you think that that's going? Do you think it's a tepid support that's being basically forced by the number of protests and the outrage that's happening across the Arab world? Or do you think that there could be a more substantive shift here where Israel has kind of overstepped in a way that won't be easily ignored?
Well, it's really a combination of all of these things, the way you described there at the end. So the popular pressure from within the Arab countries against their leaderships is starting to have an impact in the way you described it, that Arab countries are staying away from this knuckle-headed American idea that you can create a coalition of Arabs and Israelis and Americans to fight somebody who's trying to help the Palestinians. Can't do it. You know, I'm old enough to remember several of these attempts. Alexander Haig tried it. I think George Shultz tried it. Kissinger tried it. All kinds of people, American foreign secretaries, tried to create these coalitions of Arab countries, Israel, and the United States to fight against some common person or group or country that was an enemy or a threat. It could have been the Soviet Union back then, Qaeda, ISIS, communists, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, the Arab nationalists. They would always find a common foe in which they would try to create a coalition to push back, and it never worked. It never worked because the fundamental feeling within the bellies and the hearts and the minds of the common Arab people are so powerful for supporting Palestinian rights to live peacefully with an Israeli state that also has the right to live in peace. The Arab people will not join coalitions with the Israelis and the Americans for any purpose in the world if the Israelis and the Americans are carrying out a genocide, which they're doing right now in Gaza. It just won't happen. And the American government, the State Department, doesn't have the knowledge, the empathy, or the common decency to recognize this. They keep doing it over and over and over again. But this is, the immaturity and the amateurism of American foreign policy is a separate story that is for the Americans to resolve. But the fact of these dynamics in the region are very real. They keep recurring over and over. So the Israelis, they assassinate people. They've been assassinating people since the 1940s. They assassinated British colonial officers. The Zionist troops assassinated the first UN peace mediator, Count Folke Bernadotte, in 1948, a Swedish guy who came to negotiate a final peace after the 48 war, and Israel was created, and he was assassinated by Israelis, by Zionists. Assassination is something that they do routinely because it's part of their playbook, unfortunately, and many people do the same thing. But so they keep doing it, and if you look at the track record, every time they assassinate a leader, a more militant leader takes his place. And this has been exactly the course that's happened with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with Fatah, with any of these groups that to look at. So they keep repeating the same mistake. They think if you occupy somebody's land and colonize it, they will give in to you in the end. They won't give in to you. They will keep fighting for the 10th generation, and they will ultimately prevail. Because what the Palestinians and their Arab allies are fighting for are fundamental human decency and rights. What the Israelis are fighting for is the last vestige of Western settler colonial apartheid systems that came into our region in the 19th century, and they're the last active settler colonial movement. Any history students out there are interested in what was it like in the colonial period, go and study what the Israelis are doing in the West Bank today or in Gaza. And this will not prevail. It's so against every strain of human decency and the rule of law that it will one day have to accept that they have to negotiate equal rights for Israel and for Palestine. They can't force any solution down our throats. They're trying now to get the Palestinians out of Gaza into
Well,
Sinai.
that's what I was going to ask you about. These recent comments that provoked, I think, for maybe not for the first time, but one of the strongest responses from our State Department to what has been any number of statements from senior Israeli officials and spokespeople that have at best alluded to ethnic cleansing and at worst called for it directly. You had Smotritch and Ben Gvir saying, Smotritch said on the news on Saturday, quote, "We want to encourage willful immigration. We need to find countries willing to take them in. We cannot withdraw from any territory. We are in the Gaza Strip. Not only do I not rule out Jewish settlement there, I believe it is also an important thing." That's Ben Gvir. He said that on Monday. This war presents an opportunity to concentrate on encouraging the migration of the residents of Gaza. And in response, you finally got the U.S. State Department saying, quote, "This rhetoric is inflammatory and irresponsible." That was from Matthew Miller just earlier this week. Do you see that as any kind of change from the American State Department, or simply their hand being forced because of how explicit the calls for ethnic cleansing are coming from such senior Israeli officials?
Well, I don't think what the American State Department officials are saying is sincere. And I say this with a heavy heart. As an American citizen and a Palestinian, I say this with deep pain. The American State Department and president are not serious when they talk about humanitarian aid for the Palestinians, while at the same time they provide the funding and the arms and the diplomatic cover at the UN to allow the genocide to continue. So I cannot take seriously anything any American official says about Palestine and Israel. They've proven it with their track record, unfortunately. They'll have to work hard to regain a minimum of credibility down the road. If they were to take action, that would make a difference, but they're not taking action. Therefore, that's a real shame for the American spokespeople and shapers of foreign policy, America's relations with the world, to be seen by most of the world as a bunch of incompetent, insincere clowns and performers for the political class that supports them. This is a terrible legacy for any American government to have. And for somebody like Joe Biden, who's now routinely called Genocide Joe, this must be awful. I mean, it's terrible for a man of his age and all the things he's tried to do for his country to end his career in this way. But it's happening. So this is what colonialism is all about. This is why we see this as a battle to end the colonial period. It means ending the Zionist colonial annexation and grabbing of Palestinian land and expelling Palestinians, and ending the colonial habits of Americans and the governments of the US and Great Britain and a few others who feel they can come in here and do anything they want. They've done this for 200 years, but they just can't do it anymore. And at some point, we hope they learn the lesson and we all live happily ever after.
I mean, it does feel like at very least the hypocrisy of the American government is being exposed increasingly, not just because of the statements of Israeli senior officials, which increasingly feel like admissions which are now being taken to the International Criminal Court by South Africa and Turkey, and we'll see where that goes, but also because of statements from our own State Department officials, which are so out of, and national spokespeople that are so out of step with what our eyes in the news is telling us about what's going on and America's role, as you just alluded to, in blocking the UN or any other organization for interceding on the behalf of Palestinians. I want to play you a clip from just Wednesday, State Department spokesperson Matt Miller responding to Ryan Grimm, my former colleague, asking him about these statements alluding to ethnic cleansing coming out of Israel.
Yeah, Ryan.
Thanks, Matt. To pick up on your response to Smotritch and Ben Gvir yesterday, you and Linda Thomas Greenfield both had similar statements. You both said in your statements, quote, "There should be no mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza." Given that you both had the same word-for-word statement, it seems like there was thought put into that. Why use the word should there? There should be no mass displacement. Would you be willing to make a more definitive comment, like there must?
There must not be. Yeah. No. There.
And then to get to Ben Gvir's response, which I'm sure you saw, he posted on Twitter, with all due respect, we are not another star on the American flag. The United States is our best friend, but first of all, we will do what is best for the state of Israel. The emigration of hundreds of thousands from Gaza will allow the residents of the enclave or the envelope to return home and live in safety and to protect the IDF soldiers. Any response to Ben Gvir's public response to you?
So certainly Israel is a sovereign country that does make its own decisions. There is no dispute about that. The point of our of the statement that I made yesterday was that the comments that Ben Gvir and Minister Smotritch have made are in direct contradiction of Israeli government policy, as has been represented to us by multiple Israeli government officials, including the Prime Minister himself. So I'm not surprised that he continues to double down and make those statements, but they are not only in contradiction with United States policy and what we think is in the best interests of the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, the broader region, and ultimately stability in the world, but they are in direct contradiction of his own government's policy, and we believe those statements should stop.
All right. Now, Mr. Khouri, how credible is a statement that those kind of ethnic cleansing statements from Smotritch and Gvir are incompatible with Israel's own policy goals?
Well, they're probably true, but it's really pretty irrelevant. Because
what do you mean when you say it's probably true? Because what Matt Miller said was that according to the Israeli government, including specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, ethnic cleansing, he wouldn't obviously use the word ethnic cleansing, but pushing the population of Gaza out of Gaza into surrounding countries is not Israel's policy goal, at the same time that we've had numerous statements on the record to the contrary from senior officials. And we had that leaked intelligence document a month or so ago, which indicated that that was the most likely or best plan for resolving the conflict in Israel's eyes. So, is it a credible claim that Miller is making there? That Ben Gvir is an outlier here?
His view, Ben Gvir's views probably now represent the views of maybe half or more of the Israeli people. This is a very difficult situation that the Israelis who 30 years ago had a majority that wanted a negotiated permanent peace with the PLO, with Arafat. Now you have this movement to the right. You have the same movement in Palestine, by the way, where people now support Hamas much more. Which is to support for fighting for your rights. That's all that the Palestinians say who support Hamas. That only by fighting will we get our rights. Then we'll figure out what we negotiate to live in peace with the Israelis. That'll be done afterwards. So this shift to the right is going on everywhere. It's going on in the United States. It's going on in Europe. It's a global phenomenon. It's one of the problems of contemporary life all around the world. The difficulty, additionally, with the Israelis and the American government, especially the State Department spokespeople, is they don't really have any ethical or legal point of moral reference. They don't really have anything to measure by. Whatever they say goes. That's their feeling. This is what colonialism's all about. International law, UN resolutions, treaties, conventions, genocide conventions, whatever. These things don't mean anything to the American government or to the Israeli government in this situation in the Middle East. They might mean something to them with the Rohingya or with somebody else, but here in our situation, these rules of law are not applicable. In the eyes, this is how we interpret the performance of the U.S. government and the Israeli government. And also within the Israeli government, you have such a range of views that they don't have one clear policy. They don't have a clear policy on Gaza. They don't have a clear policy on Lebanon. They don't have a clear policy on settlements and other things that they say they've annexed, like the Golan Heights and Arab East Jerusalem. They don't have a consensus on these issues because they've never had consensus on the concept of a Jewish state. From 1896, when Zionism was born, until today, there's never been clarity in Israel about what does it mean to have a Jewish state. Do you have a place for non-Jews, like Christian Palestinians, like my family in Israel? Do you want this state to keep expanding as it's been doing since the beginning of the 20th century? What does a Jewish state mean? Where are its borders? They talk of biblical Israel. Well, the Bible, with all due respect, and as a Christian and I've lived all my life in Muslim societies, and I have great respect for the Bible, but the Bible is not a verified document of fact. It is a compilation of great literature and political rhetoric written by the victor. You know, it's interesting that Netanyahu gave the quote about Amalek in the Old Testament, where God tells him, go kill the Amalek. Amalek are the Amalekites, the people who lived east of Palestine. And they were seen to be the enemies of the Hebrews back then during the Exodus and around that period. And the Bible says, kill them all, kill their women, kill their children, kill their cattle, destroy their cities. And it's extraordinary that he makes that quotation from the Bible, basically telling his soldiers, kill with total abandon and joy, and nobody will prevent you. It's fascinating to me as a student of archaeology and history, and I've written some archaeology books, that the Amalek were one of the people of the East, as they were called in the Bible, all the people living east of the Jordan River, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Amalekites, and others. And it turns out that the people of the East are now creating these regional, integrated, coordinated military resistance groups. The people who are not Israelite or Jewish or Hebrew or whatever you want to call them, today we say that they're not Israelis. The Hezbollah, Hamas, people in Iraq, people in Yemen, these are the Amalekites today. And the Amalekites have turned out to have allies and great capabilities when they were given a chance to show what they can do. And they would ideally want to show their prowess in a peaceful, recognized sovereign state where they live in peace and with full rights to their citizens. And they're willing to do this next to an Israeli state that also has peace and secure borders and sovereignty for its citizens. So the circle, go back to the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament and come up to today, and you see the same forces at play. The problem with settler colonial apartheid racist systems, ethno-nationalist superior military systems like Zionism, and which became the State of Israel, is they're blind to the lessons and the facts of history. They're just so obsessed with their own rights and dominance. And this maybe comes out of a fear from what the Jews experienced in Europe under the white racist Europeans and Russians and Americans. Maybe that fear has been so intense, and of course with the Holocaust, it reached a peak. And it still maybe drives many of them. I don't know. This is something that psychiatrists have to tell us about.
Yeah, well, we did just recently have an episode where we touched on some of these themes with a psychiatrist, Dr. Gabor Mate. So we won't linger too far there. I did want to ask you to show you one other clip that was going around virally today. You alluded to, obviously, the South African petition to bring Israel before the International Criminal Court. It's the signatory of the Genocide Convention. Our own spokesperson, John Kirby, responded to a question today about what he made of the 84-page report out of South Africa that articulated all of the evidence that what is happening in the Gaza Strip is, in fact, a genocide. This was John Kirby's response. I'd like to get you to weigh in.
South Africa's filed this 84-page lawsuit against Israel, accusing them of genocide. Israel says that this is blood libel. Does Washington agree? And where does this put Washington and Pretoria?
We find this submission meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever.
Well, I tell you, if I was walking down the street one evening and I saw John Kirby walking in my direction, I would run to the other side of the street. Not because he would hurt me, but because rays of incoherence would radiate out of his mind and infect me into speaking in total incoherent, untrue, mediagenic phrases. What these people do is extraordinary. I mean, that I've read that submission to the international. It's not the criminal court; it's the International Court of Justice. That's an amazing document. It's one of the most accurate, clear, compelling cases for the genocide that Israel is doing with the assistance of the United States. And for the U.S. government simply to make fun of it like that is really just making fun of the American government and reinforces my sense and the sense of, I would say, 3/4 of the people of the entire planet, that the United States government doesn't care about the rights of people around the world, doesn't know how to interact with people around the world, and doesn't ever want to reach a situation where it feels that the people of the South, the global South especially, have the same rights as the white people of the North. So it's terrible to see American officials talk like this, but this is the low state to which we've reached. And this is something for Americans to figure out. Why does our government support the genocide and refuse to allow the Israeli government to be subjected to the same rules as all other people in the world? So this is something that we can't really figure out talking about it here, but this is an issue that is important to be discussed in public, and it's good for you to raise it.
Well, look, as we wrap up here, I feel like I would be remiss not to ask you about your own family and what their experiences are like. You said your family is from Nazareth. Do you still have family there now? And if so, I wonder how they're experiencing life in Israel as Christian Palestinians in the wake of October 7th.
Yes, we still have family. Nazareth is an interesting case because it was one of the cities that was not ethnically cleansed and attacked by the Free-State Zionist militia and gangs. They had plans to go all over Palestine, and Palestine was supposed to be partitioned into a Jewish state and an Arab-Palestinian state. And before 6 months before the partition was supposed to happen in May 48, the Zionist group started going all over the place, attacking people, burning villages, scaring people, putting bombs here and there to get them out. And it worked. They got half of the Palestinians left. Nazareth was not subjected to that for reasons that people are still debating. Some people say it was because the local commander, a Canadian Jewish fellow, just refused to do that order, to do the ethnic cleansing. He thought it was just immoral and he wouldn't do it. Other people say no, it was David Ben-Gurion and senior Zionist leaders who felt that because Nazareth has such a special place in the world as a city of Jesus and his family, that it would look pretty bad. In other words, they were concerned about PR more than anything else. And for that reason, people like my family stayed there. My parents were, lived there and lived there in the 30s and 40s. And then my father came over to the U.S. as a journalist to cover the partition debate at the UN, and of course couldn't go back. When Israel was created, he was not allowed to go back. The Israelis don't want anybody there other than Jewish citizens. So my family stayed there and several generations, and they're citizens of Israel, but they're also nationals of Palestine. And it's a tricky balancing act. They appreciate the good things that Israel does, and Israel does many good things: education, social security, labor laws, things like that. They appreciate those things. And sorry, let me repeat that. So my family who live in Nazareth are citizens of the state of Israel, but they're nationals of Palestine. They feel both Palestinian and they acknowledge their Israeli legal status, their Israeli passport. So they've gone to school, they get health insurance, they pay their taxes, and they have a pretty decent material life. compared to people around the region, and they appreciate it. They understand the good things that Israel does for its people, but they don't have full representation in parliament. They don't have equal social expenditures by the Israeli government on their health and education and social services. There's clear discrepancies on how they're supported versus how Jewish Israelis are supported. So there are stresses and problems, and for many years they were subjected to military rule and things like that. But this is an issue that the Israelis themselves have to keep addressing and figure out, what does it mean to have an Israeli state? They call it a state of the Jewish people, but not all of its citizens are Jewish. So this is one of the problems with settler colonial Zionism. Again and again, we keep running into the settler colonial Zionist problems that keep emerging, and this is one of them.
I'm curious, just because, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm just curious to hear you talk very specifically about your family's experiences, because it's such an insight that we don't ordinarily have. I mean, I've heard stories and read reporting about how Arab Palestinians have felt afraid to articulate publicly any sympathy for the people of Gaza, people who have had their houses visited by police because of social media posts. Obviously, an escalation of violence in places like the West Bank, reporting of IDF soldiers spitting on Christians in front of that church. I mean, these kind of stories are coming out, and I just wondered, I don't know if how regularly you've been in contact with any of your family who are still there, but I am curious about just what the experience is like of being an Arab Palestinian right now, an Arab Israeli right now.
The experience hasn't changed much in the last 30 or 40 years. They have to walk a fine line. They know that if they become too vocal in supporting Palestinian rights or criticizing the Israeli governments, they'll pay a price. And there's ways that
what does that mean?
Well, they can be denied a job. They can be hassled by the tax service. The same things that they do in the U.S. government or the British government, or all governments of the world do this. But this government in particular does this mostly to the Arabs of Palestine, not to the Jews of Palestine so much. So the feeling of Palestinian Israelis or Israeli Arabs, I mean, they don't even know what to call themselves.
Yeah.
I call them Israeli Arabs. They're Arabs, but or the Palestinians of Israel. They feel that they have to be guarded in what they say, how they perform in public, what they wear. They won't go around with a keffiyeh probably. So they have to be very careful about not provoking Jewish Israelis. I mean, not all Jewish Israelis are going to hurt them, but some of them will. Now with these right-wing extremists in government, it's open season. You can do what you want to Palestinians, and they're doing it in the West Bank. Less so in Israel itself, but it happens there as well. And
and you said your dad, he had come to the United States for a reporting trip, and then simply wasn't allowed back in Israel afterward?
Right. So he came from Palestine, from Nazareth. He left Palestine when it was under British mandate control.
I see.
And his passport, which I still have, and his ID card as a journalist, have English, Hebrew, and Arabic on them. And it says the mandated government of Palestine. And he came to the U.S. planning to spend a year or two, report on the partition or report on the debate, not knowing what would happen, and then go back. He couldn't go back because partition happened. The state of Israel was created, and Palestine stopped to exist. The West Bank and Gaza were eventually administered by Egypt and Jordan. He tried to come back, but they wouldn't allow him in. He was lucky. He got a job with the UN in New York. And I was born in New York in 1948, the year of the partition, the year of the Nakba. So I've lived with this issue my whole life. And this is a situation that affected hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Some Palestinians who found themselves outside the country tried to sneak back in, and they could in the year or two after 48. But the Israelis eventually clamped down really hard and put people in jail or shot people who were trying to come back home or whatever.
Did your dad? Did he ever visit Nazareth again?
Yes, he was able to go visit, and I went with him as a child using his UN passport. I got permission, and we went into Nazareth and spent a week there. And then my family came out to Jerusalem, Arab East Jerusalem, when it was under Jordanian control. So we were, and I then when after the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement happened, I lived in Jordan in 1994. We could cross the river from Jordan to the occupied West Bank and then go to Israel quite easily because I had an American passport. I still do, and I could enter Israel enter the occupied West Bank, but you have to go through an Israeli immigration point on my American passport, and they let me in, and off I went. So I went off and visited. I went to Gaza a few times and trained journalists there. I went to Beirut. I went to Nazareth a few times, and all over the West Bank, Ramallah, and Jerusalem, etc. So the thing that you learn when you do this, when you travel all over Palestine and Israel, you learn, first of all, that there's a lot of room there that could easily absorb hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees peacefully. If they wanted to end this conflict, they could be ended in 24 hours by negotiators. You also learn that Palestinians and Israelis have learned to live together. They disagree on big issues of identity and national rights, but they learn to live together because they always lived together before that. And I used to hear from my father and from older Palestinians, I used to ask, what was it like in 1935 and 1942? And they would tell us all these stories about their Jewish neighbors or their Jewish business partners or their Jewish friends at school they played football with, that these societies did not have old blood feuds or anything like that. The Israelis try to present this picture in that sense, that this is a visceral, deep tribal hatred that the Arabs have of Israelis, which is not true. It's part of the Israeli propaganda book, which is a very extensive book, but the Israeli propaganda hasn't changed since the 1960s. And I'm working on some research now and looking at how the propaganda evolved. Very little it evolved, but how they've used the same propaganda technique, and they still use them today. This was one of the things they kept saying all the time, that we can't live with the Arabs. They hate us. They don't want us to live here. And that's not true at all. When Zionism started, and when the idea of more Jews coming to Palestine began in 1905, 1910, the Arabs had no problem with that because there'd always been local Jewish communities there in Safed and Acre and Jerusalem and Hebron. And there's communities that go back hundreds of years. But they were a small minority, like the Christians. The Christians were about maybe 6%, 7%. The Jews were about 3-4%. It was a minority, but they all lived pretty peacefully and reasonably. And there's all kinds of books that have been written by Israelis and Arabs about this situation. The real conflict started really in 1929 was the year when you first had the communal clashes in Palestine for various reasons, because mainly the Palestinians realized that the British were helping the Zionists take over more land to create a Jewish state. And then, of course, in Europe, in the 30s, you started to get the Nazis and the real pogroms against them, and ended in the Holocaust. That added the pressure. So as immigration of Jews from Europe and Russia got bigger and bigger, and by the way, the wonderful peace-loving, human rights defending, democracy-loving British and Americans refused to let the Jews into England or the United States because they're anti-Semitic. The people running these governments are anti-Semites. They didn't like the Jews. Yeah. In fact, they wanted the state of Israel to be created so they could send all the Jews there. That's one of the things that's constantly debated.
Yeah, the irony of them saying the Arab nations won't take the Palestinians because they don't care about them, when our own history is that we wouldn't take the Jews because of the virulent anti-Semitism. I said this last week's episode actually was with a historian of Zionism from Dartmouth who was talking about a lot of this history.
Oh, yeah.
And I can never not. I mean, it's obviously just one family, and the magnitude of the Holocaust was so much bigger than this. But because of the special kind of place Anne Frank's narrative has as part of our national discourse and the way we're all taught it in school, I remember at some point in high school or college learning that America denied Otto Frank's application to come to the United States, and I have never forgotten that lesson, and will bring it up at every opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. So there's a lot of stuff in history. None of us are perfect. We all have problems. We all have double standards. We all have some hypocrisy in us. But when it comes to the level of official policy, that's when it gets to be a problem.
Yeah.
If some individual doesn't like his Black neighbor or her Hispanic neighbor or her Muslim neighbor, they don't have to like them, but they shouldn't prevent them from living there, and they shouldn't deny them any rights. When you start getting that denial codified in laws, you become an apartheid racist state. And that's what Israel is now, and it's recognized all over the world. Everybody's calling it an Israeli state of apartheid. But these are human problems. These are man-made problems. They're not acts of nature or acts of God. These can all be fixed, and we can reach a situation one day where Israelis and Palestinians and all other Arabs can coexist in relative peace when they all have the same rights. That can be done if we have the political leaderships willing to do it, which we don't now. It's not in Palestine, not in Israel, not in the United States. And in Europe, it's increasingly
I was going to applaud you for your optimism as we wrapped until you said, but we don't have that political leadership.
Well, right now, but leaders change. Leaders change.
Yeah.
And some of these guys are going to be in jail. Some of them will go to the International Criminal Court. Netanyahu will probably be in jail for his criminal deeds inside Israel. But a better day will come when really great leaders will recognize the possibilities of a negotiated peace. And we don't then have to have groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the settler rampaging gangs and Ben Gvir and Smotritch in the government. And these radical movements on all sides will not be needed if fundamental decency can be incorporated into the laws of the state and the performance of the governing powers.
Yeah. Well, look, Rami Khouri, thank you so much for spending so much time with me today. I really, really do appreciate it. And thank you for sharing your kind of personal story and perspective on this. It is really, I think, useful to hear about. I will say, I've been reflecting on what it means, how much simpatico there has been, how much what's going on in Palestine has resonated with so many Black Americans. Yeah. And I just had a bit of a heated debate with my libertarian colleague on my morning show when we were talking about some of these issues, the Civil War, the impetus for it. And I do find that in the United States, these conversations end up being very stressful because there's all of these factual debates where people, it feels from my subjective perspective, often try to minimize what happened to Black Americans, make comparisons between the level of suffering that are intended to, and other things that are intended to diminish what Black Americans went through. And so for me to be able to talk to you, who can reference your own father's experience with the Nakba, without not being allowed to return to his country, you having been born in 1948, and to have had a much longer historical perspective on this than I have as well, is valuable. But it also, there's a part of me that's really interested in hearing that because I'm so jealous of the ability. I mean, I don't wish I lived closer to slavery, obviously, but there's something really powerful about the ability to say, you can't gaslight me out of my truth. Here is the person who literally went through this. And then another part of me is fearful that not too distant future, Palestinians born this year, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, are going to be gaslit if things don't change in the exact same way Black Americans are gaslit about the magnitude of what was done to us and our deservedness to substantive justice. So I just feel like I had to say that.
this is the next step for all of us, for all these all subjugated people to really work together and create a better system for everybody, including our former subjugators, who should be allowed to live in peace once they've admitted the wrongs they did, like happened in South Africa. It'll happen one day, I think. We just got to keep working at it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you again. Can you tell the audience where they can find more of your work on the internet and beyond?
Well, the best place to find my work is to follow me on Twitter, where my name is @Rami Khouri, just one word, Rami Khouri. And I write columns regularly for Jazeera online, the Jazeera website, mostly in their opinion piece. Those are the two places where I do most of my writing, and I'm writing for the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. once a month now. So I urge people to go to the Arab Center in Washington, look them up online, and they have amazing analyses about the region, but their poll of people across the entire Arab world every year or two is really something important, because it gives you insights into what the Arab people actually think, not what these nutcases in the State Department and the White House tell you they think.
All right. Well, thank you again. And thank you to all of you for listening. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.